Today's July 31st, 2023, and I'm honored today to have Dan Cohen, an intrepid reporter. Tell us, Dan, your journey, your interests.
Thanks a lot for having me. First of all, I'm a journalist with Redacted, the YouTube Rumble channel, hosted by Clayton and Natalie Morris. I've been working with them since about November of last year. I also have my own little channel, which I don't pay as much attention to, is a bit neglected, but called Uncaptured Media. That's what the whole alphabet soup is behind me. And, the idea of uncaptured media and how I like to think, especially at this point, is just remaining psychologically, mentally uncaptured from psyops, from all kinds of kind of traps that are set for us to fall into kind of propagandistic narratives and not taking anything for granted, and not playing team red or team blue, not letting that guide my understanding of reality. But so I've been in journalism since 2014. I first started I basically quit my job. I was doing a variety of jobs and went to Israel Palestine, spent about 3 years there, made a documentary called Killing Gaza, which documented the 2014 Israeli war on Gaza and the aftermath. From there, I moved back to Washington. I moved to Washington, D.C., where I live now. I was working for RT America for about a year and a half. And then
RT is Russia Times?
Russia Today is what it originally stood for. But yeah, it's Russian-funded media. And, it's not that I wanted to work for Russian-funded media particularly. It was just that was the only outlet that would have me on to talk about what I was seeing in the Gaza Strip, for example. And I saw there was an opportunity. I mean, ironically, people disparage it as Russian propaganda, but I had total freedom there. I could pretty much cover whatever I want.
It's an irony these days. Like, I would never have thought, from 2001 that I would be looking at Al Jazeera and, favorably, relatively. I think a lot of media that is theoretically from hostile lands, at least it's a different prism from which you can look at things. And I find that often is useful in the scientific world. And if we're going to treat news scientifically, quasi-scientifically, obviously, there's a lot of personalities involved, but there are different approaches. And I think sometimes in order to get the full essence of something, if you don't want to, silo yourself like the parable of the seven blind guys with the elephant, you tend to, think an elephant's a tree trunk if you only hang around the foot. And a lot of times, you have these different perspectives. So I think there's something to be lauded there. It seems to me you have a genuine curiosity. And can you tell us a little bit about how your curiosity has run into some of the, say, stonewalls of some political orthodoxies, considering where you're from? Perhaps you can map a little bit of that journey for us, if you don't mind.
Sure. So yeah, my background is really the anti-war left. That was my kind of primary focus of journalism, is looking at propaganda, kind of deconstructing psychological operations, war propaganda. And I was, very focused on Syria, for example. And there was, all kinds of crazy propaganda to gin up support for the war on Syria, which is really ongoing to this day, at least in the economic sense. So when the COVID era started, I was very sure that I, was like immune to propaganda, in a sense. And that actually kind of lulled me to sleep in a way. It lowered my guard. And I was very much following, at that point I was following, there were a lot of kind of psyops against China to gin up support for kind of separatist movements in China that are funded by the U.S. government and its proxies. The Hong Kong riots, which were very positively portrayed in the United States, in Western media and U.S. media. I mean, I showed how the National Endowment for Democracy, various CIA cutouts were involved there. The claims of a Uyghur genocide, I examined that. All these things that really, if you examine them closely, they kind of turn to sand. And so I was, watching China so closely, and they're dealing with some crazy virus. And I don't have any sort of medical scientific background, so I didn't have the literacy to be able to kind of understand what was happening. And I sort of took things for granted in a way. And I kind of, thought, okay, well now, now this bad virus is coming here and we all have to wear, no one's wearing masks here. Oh my God, this is terrible. We have to do what China is doing. That's because they're taking care of their people. And, a month later, all of a sudden everyone's wearing a mask. Then it's like the whole COVID kind of like mindset takes over in the US. And I had actually just become a father at that point. My daughter was born on February 26, 2020. So I was home all the time anyway.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So February 26, 2020, it was already like people were starting to become aware of it, but it wasn't like, national emergency lockdown yet. So a few weeks later, it all kind of explodes. I'm mostly at home anyway, so I wasn't seeing the like direct impact, but I'd go to the grocery store, of course, and it was kind of a strange thing, but I wasn't questioning it. It wasn't until really kind of the vaccines came around and they started hearing about vaccine mandates, that kind of thing, that I thought, wait a minute, this is kind of crazy. And also, I remember when they were talking about developing a vaccine, I knew that, it doesn't make sense that these vaccines would actually stop the spread. Like same with the flu, I thought because of the flu vaccine, well, that's not supposed to stop you from getting the flu. That's just supposed to make it the symptoms not as bad.
Right. It's attenuation. Some experience. If you've been to a city before, you can kind of navigate a little bit better. It's not to say you're not there. So if you've been to Washington D.C. a couple times, you get there another time. So in a sense, inoculation is like that. It's giving your immune system, your police force, or whatever, change analogy slightly, some prior experience, so you can better navigate that upcoming situation. I used to have my 80 rule with flu shot that, it works for 80% of the strains. It's predictive. They develop it prior to the flu actually coming out. Probably it can be faster now, but at the time I was prescribing, I'm pro-vax in the sense that I've given out tens of thousands of vaccines over my career, maybe slightly less. I don't know. And then they're 80%. They work on 80% of the people, and they kind of cover 80% of the symptoms. So it's like between if you do the minus the obverse of that, comes out to about 50% effective. 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8 is around 40. I think it's 0.48 or whatever the numbers. So it's not a full deal. And you're right, it doesn't hamper, it doesn't really stop the spread. But it's if you do kind of game this thing, you don't need to stop it everywhere, and you don't need to give it to everybody. You really I think most efficacious if you give it to the people who are most in transit. So if you could go to, I don't know where what town you're living in, but if you go to Grand Central Station or South Station or whatever station, Union Station, and you did vaccinated willingly, say, the people there, now those are your travelers. They're going from place to place to place to place. And a lot of people who are sedentary in their cul-de-sacs, they don't necessarily need as much in terms of vaccination. Obviously you might want to do the elderly because they're sick and old. Anyway, I'm sorry for that little diatribe.
That's okay. So yeah, I mean, I understood, just that these vaccines are not going to actually stop people from getting it. It's at best it'll make the symptoms less severe. So, but it was being portrayed like, oh, this is going to be the silver bullet. Once everyone gets the vaccine, we're going to be good. No more lockdowns, no more social distancing, etc. And so I started to really kind of question at that point. And then it all kind of started to just fall apart. And I started to see we were subjected to a psychological operation. And since then, it's just kind of, it's just opened up more and more and more. And now to the point where, I understand that there actually was no pandemic, and that what we lived through was essentially like a bad flu season. It was a bad respiratory virus season. And that was portrayed as a pandemic through, I think, the greatest psychological operation that has ever been carried out in human history. And so through that process, once I started to open my mouth a little bit and, start asking questions and I was kind of, you know, kicked out of the left unofficially, where, you know, I lost
A polite
friends.
society.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, people, you know, who I, you know, not only was friends with, who I'd have at my house and that kind of thing, but, you know, people who I ideologically were very much on the same wavelength. They understood like war propaganda. You know, they saw like the Syrian chemical weapons attacks. They understood that that was a creation of the
Yeah, no, that's
national
an interesting
security
thing.
state.
So that's really fascinating. You put that up. Isn't it? Michael Crichton, the late author and MD. You know, I think he wrote Jurassic Park, amongst other things. The Andromeda Strain.
Hmm.
He came up with the Gelman amnesia. Have you heard of that?
No.
So I don't want to spend too much time on this. People can look it up. But basically, he's reading the newspaper. Murray Gell-Mann, the physicist, a Nobel physicist, and he's reading an article in physics. He's like, "Oh my God, these guys know nothing of what they're writing. I'm a physicist." But then when he reads on, you know, on Syria, or I don't know, our cornflakes, he assumes it's all right. It's all real. But that's the amnesia part. So the Gell-Mann amnesia, which Crichton kind of developed as a story, is that when you see it in your own field of expertise, you're like, oh my God, these guys are like, they're just jabbering. And then you forget about it when you're reading something about which you know less. So I
Right.
think you've made a kind of an interesting bridge, of applying appropriately against Gelman amnesia. That you're saying, look, you guys are skeptical when it's Syria, but here you're eating this, you know, you're swallowing this whole.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And you know, the more I looked at it, I realized it's the exact same propaganda models that the national security state has used outwardly, and now it's being turned inward. You know, create a a threat or inflate a threat, whether it's, you know, real or imagined. Inflate the threat, and then have some kind of preconceived solution that is not a solution at all, and there's no total ulterior motive. And that's exactly what COVID was. So, you know, going into in Syria, supposedly right now the U.S. military is fighting ISIS, but ISIS is in northwest Syria. The U.S. is in northeast Syria, where all the oil is, and it's just stealing oil. So you know, to keep it on COVID, it's like there are so many parallels. There's so much propaganda, and it's just been a real kind of humbling experience going through this, and you know, understanding how powerful propaganda is. And you know, it's made me, over the last couple of years, I've had to reevaluate so much of what I thought, and you know, I'm just constantly kind of
Well,
looking at.
that's laudable. I mean, I think I said it. You know, you and I may not agree on everything politically, but I respect somebody who is willing to engage and debate and put things out. I'm sure you are far more knowledgeable on, you know, facts on the ground in most of these places about which I read and probably have my own set of, you know, Gelman amnesia. Um, have you traveled as well? I assume you did in your book in Gaza. Um, and excuse me, your movie in Gaza. And I noticed lately you're focusing on Haiti.
Yeah.
Have you been there? What's I know it's kind of maybe, I mean, it's our show, so we can segue. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about. You know, I was reading your Twitter feed, and I can put that up later for people to look at. But you're talking about Haiti. I'm like, did I miss something? What's going on? There's really not anything in the news, but you've been pointing out that you know, there's something developing. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what's been your work in that regard?
Yeah, so I started following Haiti pretty closely after the president was assassinated in July
Was it
2021.
Moises or something?
Exactly, Jovenel Moise. He was assassinated in what is still an unsolved mystery, though it is pretty clear the U.S. was involved.
Hmm.
Um, and so I did a documentary on kind of the backdrop to that moment, which is there is an armed group with revolutionary intentions that has federated. It's basically a former cop who was burned by the system. He was blamed for a massacre that never happened for basically political reasons. He was sacrificed, and that kind of radicalized him and made him it changed how he saw the whole system, where instead of, you know, working within the confines to do what he could despite corruption, he said, wait a minute, this whole thing has got to go. Haiti is the most exploited country in the Western Hemisphere. There's immense poverty. I've spent a fair amount of time there now.
Mm.
The most extreme poverty I've ever seen. It's just unbelievable. It's kind of unimaginable to
Yeah.
most
No,
Americans.
I think it's one of the poorest countries on earth.
Yeah,
I'm going to give maybe a little pushback. When you say exploited, I mean, the Dominican Republic shares Hispaniola with it. And I'm not saying DR is wealthy, but it's wealthier. There are more trees, extant, so forth. I mean, when you talk about exploitation, why would people exploit only half of Hispaniola if that, exploitable? I mean, I'm only
the Dominican
feeling as if,
Republic.
there's a fair amount
Yeah.
of incompetence and division, and there can be a cycle of tragedy and violence that's self-inflicted.
Sure, but well, you have to understand that the island of Hispaniola, or as its original name was Haiti. The Dominican Republic was created essentially by wealthy interests supported by the U.S. in order to overthrow the Haitian Revolution and essentially reimpose slavery. The Haitian Revolution was an effort to get rid of the slave system, and you had three empires attack it. The British, Spanish, and French all attacked Haiti after its revolution
What year
in
is
order.
this?
This is the revolution was 1791 to
Is this
1804.
Toussaint?
Toussaint was one of the big revolutionary leaders, yes, of the Haitian Revolution. So essentially, decades later, the U.S. I mean, all the time the U.S. was trying to overthrow this revolution, to roll it back, and they actually managed to split off and create the Dominican Republic. And it's always been kind of a cudgel against Haiti. And so one of the big reasons, for example, there is more wealth in the Dominican Republic is because when the Cuban Revolution happened, the oligarchs from Cuba that were tied to the U.S. went to the Dominican Republic. So there's certainly more wealth there, but there is also quite a bit of wealth in Haiti itself. If you go up in the hills, kind of above the capital of Port-au-Prince, I mean, I filmed these. You can see them in my reports. I filmed these. These are mansions with drone. I filmed it with a drone.
Well, you see the same thing in PLO land. You're calling Palestine and West Bank and so forth. I mean, a lot of the there's corruption, however you slice it. People.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, above Nablus, for example, is the Palestinian city of Nablus is one of the wealthiest oligarchs. But these people, this guy is like tied. He basically benefits from the Israeli occupation. But I mean, in terms of the oligarchs in Haiti, if we keep it on Haiti,
Yep.
They are tied to the United States. So you have this massive underclass of people who work in sweatshops, live in literal lakes of sewage that comes down from above the rest of the city, and they don't have any way to improve their situation. Their government doesn't help them. They're they have no way to organize, and they live on about $1 per day. So that's basically what this guy, the subject of my documentary, is trying to organize the people against. And so if you go into his neighborhood, for example, which we show, the streets are clean. There's clean water for people to drink. They have programs to feed people, this kind of thing. So it's really, they are pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, and they've basically federated 9 different armed groups, more than 9. It was originally 9, in order to have this kind of social system to defend the borders of their neighborhoods and to expand it to basically have a revolution. That's the idea. And so that's this imminent, it's an undetermined but imminent date, this invasion that the Biden administration is pushing for very heavily, but is trying to basically keep itself out of it doesn't want to be seen as the force behind it is moving along. So there's opposition from Russia and China and the Security Council. It's all playing out in a politically, but the U.S. is very determined.
I hadn't been aware about the Biden administration. Where do you get your sensibilities or feelers about the Biden administration doing this?
Well, I mean, you can look. There's it's widely reported. The Blinken said, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said on
Well, I like to call him I like to call him Anthony. I like to call him Abe Blinken.
Abe Lincoln, yeah. That's such a sad insult to Abraham Lincoln, but I mean, there's a Voice of America article I referred to today where he says, from July 6th, where he says we are looking for someone to lead the intervention in Haiti. They use euphemisms where they say we're going to reinforce the Haitian National Police, or we're going to use
what could possibly go wrong.
Right, exactly. We're going to have a multinational force. So no, this is 100% in the works. I reported that this invasion was coming in September of last year, of 2022. I interviewed the former U.S. Special Envoy to Haiti, Daniel Foote, and he said it's coming. It's either going to be we're going to use special forces or and he said that's what I want, to have low profile, small footprint, or it's going to be 25,000 Marines if the Biden administration doesn't use special forces.
Yeah,
so one way or the other, it's happening.
So a couple of questions just bubble up. The Clinton Global Initiative. How did that leave Haiti? Figuratively and literally. A. B. You mentioned the anti-war left. Is there one? Does RFK embody that? And what happens, when people come in power? Do they just kind of follow along with whatever comes up the docket? I mean, I personally think this is a little bit diversionary, but I personally think the Burisma, however many millions of dollars got diverted to the Bidens, I think that's the best ROI in the history of mankind. Considering I don't know what the number is, how many tens of billions or whatever the number is now that have gone to Ukraine. It's clearly the best return on investment. I had a friend ages ago who said local government is your best corruption dollar value. You should, pal up with your local politicians because then you get a permit or whatever. And I dispute that. I think that personally, I think federal corruption has to be the best dollar value. I mean, it's higher initial investment. If you don't have millions of dollars to give to the nephew, cousin, brother, son, whatever of your potential future leader, it's not going to work. So. Anyway, so there's a lot to unpack there. Just in order, Clinton. We recall there was some, kerfuffle in Haiti, and they were in there. What happened with that? And what is the anti-war left? Is there such a thing? And how does it apply here? And what is the alignment politically with any potential, next round of presidential electors?
Yeah, the Clinton Global Initiative was heavily involved in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, which killed tens of thousands of people and just destroyed entire neighborhoods. And so, the so-called international community came together, raised billions of dollars for Haiti, all this stuff, very feel good. And the vast majority of it, like 98% of it, all, didn't go to Haitians. It went to like NGOs and back to Washington, contractors. And it was just a big money laundering scheme. And so Haiti, got screwed royally, and the Clintons are hated. They are reviled in Haiti, for good reason. So it left Haiti in absolute shambles. It robbed them blind. And in terms of the anti-war left, I would argue no, there's not much of an anti-war left. So it's kind of a sort of a meaningless term. The existing anti-war left is very small and very sectarian. The parties here in Washington, D.C. that have organized anti-war rallies over the years, they insist that on ideological purity, that you agree with them on every single issue, or else you're not allowed to come to their anti-war rally. And so, they just are very small and very marginal. So instead of trying to build an anti-war movement saying, well, maybe we need to talk to, libertarians who oppose foreign wars. Maybe for slightly, their reasons are a little bit different, and how they understand these things are a little bit different.
Yeah, but you have alignment. I mean, the essence of politics. I mean, the root word is polis, which is the people. And if you don't have any people on your thing, then you're just pretty much talking into the mirror. And I enjoy that, because I find the guy in the mirror is, handsome and brilliant, but doesn't really go that far. You probably have the same experience. Anyway, so
the RFK question. I mean,
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think RFK represents a on one hand, I do see that I was very hopeful about RFK at first because he has this ability to unite people of different political stripes. He obviously has, I mean, he can, attract Democrats, Republicans, independents. He has the ability to unite people in a way that, politics, they obviously the parties don't want, care to do anymore. None of the, I mean, certainly not the Democrats. I mean, they say that half the country is like what, deplorables, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So he has the ability to do that, and with his position on COVID, opposing lockdowns, these kinds of things, he's really tapped into that energy. The thing that is so jarring for me is his position on Israel Palestine, and I know probably we don't see eye to eye on this, but I mean, regardless of what you think of Israel, there is a very powerful Israel lobby that interferes in American politics. And there's an entire Al Jazeera documentary on it, actually, about how the Israel lobby operates in the United States in very shady ways. And RFK is appearing with the most vile hucksters, that are, just total political operatives of the late Sheldon Adelson, this billionaire casino mogul who worked with the CIA to imprison, to spy on Julian Assange. So he's doing RFK is on one hand saying, I'm going to, challenge neocons and Ukraine and all this stuff. Israel is he's in bed with neocons there. So to me, it's not like a sort of boutique issue that it's just one thing. It's that he's fundamentally, he fundamentally does not get something. It's like saying you're going to go against the establishment, but you're in bed with big pharma or this lobby or that lobby. It's like, it doesn't make sense.
Right. But I do think he is, you know, an emblematic or potentially, a signifier of the anti-war left. Um, I think he doesn't, I think he's skeptical about revving up a war machine and so forth. I went to his announcement speech, and it was long, and I couldn't stay for the entire thing. Um, but that was my impression, at least. Um, but I agree with you from your earlier comment about, kind of alignment with libertarian. I write for brownstone.org, and we had a tent at, I like to start it out saying Porcupine Festival, because they actually call it Pork Fest, and it doesn't. There's no pork there per se. I mean, it's porcupine. Um, but RFK Jr. spoke there at one point, as did Vivek Ramaswamy as presidential candidate, because it is in New Hampshire. Do you have any thoughts about kind of the, other candidates out there? I mean, we don't have to go political on this, but I mean, I'll kind of put that in a different context of how different are things, in terms of foreign policy presidentially. And what did you notice about the, Trump interregnum versus the kind of continuum of Obama / Biden, who are theoretically of the left and yet had much, kind of more conflicts, more incursions, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, with the continuity that I saw, frankly, between like the Obama and Trump and Biden administrations and even before them is neoconservatives. Neoconservatives, kind of shifting from administration to administration, kind of rebranding. And lately they're I mean, more they're more they've now they're back on like the left with the Democrat. I mean, we have maybe the most neoconservative government in history.
So
I mean,
could you
with
define neoconservative in this regard? Because
sure,
I'm sure I don't think the conservative is a reasonable appellation, but carry on.
sure. Oh yeah, neoconservatives are basically the ideologues of American empire and permanent war. I mean, the neoconservatives they're former
So,
Trotskyists who basically became war hawks.
right. So I belong to an angel group, and one guy there is I really love, and he always says, look, that's the way you describe your company. How would your competitors describe that? Their view of your company from their perspective. So in this case, how would neoconservatives define themselves?
I think they would say we believe in American power because it's good for the world. because the other alternative is chaos, and we put order into the world. They live, I think that, but I think the problem with that, well, they live in an ideological realm. They don't, deal with reality. And so the neoconservatives were the force behind the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war and, Syria war. And so all of these wars that I've spent my time kind of, trying to fight against or document.
Yeah. I'm not sure they were the force behind the Syrian war. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I will stipulate the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. I mean, I was reading the Weekly Standard at the time, and Bill Kristol had not seemingly become quite unhinged yet. And I mean, so just to play devil's advocate, I think if you go around the world, there are remnants of colonial empire throughout the third world, developing world, and if you're going to be in Africa, probably the better places for you to be are the post-British countries. I don't know. A, do you think that's true? B, what does that mean, if anything?
It depends. I think it's a little bit of apples and oranges in a sense, because the post-colonial countries, Syria was a colony of the French. I mean, it was a French protectorate, and but as a post-colonial state, it did very well until the dirty war on Syria began in 2011. So, it wasn't a colonial state at
well,
that
I don't think
point.
they did. I mean, I would argue they didn't do very well. They did very well compared to now. Having
Well,
utter
but it was
I think
a very
under
safe
the
place
original
to live.
Assad, Daddy Assad.
Yeah.
I don't think that it was a Hafez al-Assad. I don't think they did very well. I think they were isolationists. I think they aligned with the Soviet Union, not Russia. And I don't think they were, keeping their possibilities open for commerce and so forth, such as other countries might. I don't think
I'm talking about even just before, the 2011.
So under Bashir.
Yeah, yes. Of course there are problems, but I guess the point I'm making is, like, if we look at Africa, countries that don't go along with with the US agenda, they get sanctioned, and then they get cut off. So it's like you're basically given no choice. And then if you do go along with it, well, then you do develop an elite class of powerful oligarchs, but the masses of people do not benefit, and they end up, being exploited and living in poverty and this kind of thing.
So,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Where does that leave Dan Cohen? Are you to change your name a little bit? Are you Dan Cohen? I'm trying to make your name into Don Quixote. I could probably do a little bit. Dan Cohen, Coyote. Are you railing against windmills, and are you able to fight the fight out on the prairies, the plains by yourself? And how do you get recompense, and how do you keep your family going?
Certainly I'm politically isolated in a lot of ways, but I don't really care, in the sense that, like, my guide is the truth, wherever that leads me. I'm on, this show with you, a conservative Republican. I wouldn't have imagined that, 2-3 years ago, that I'd be doing, this kind of interview, but I'm perfectly happy to. I'll talk to basically anyone. And it's extraordinarily difficult to make it as an independent journalist. I've been, really lucky to work with Redacted, to find my, way with them. But, there are very few options, and, journalism is an extremely independent journalism. Basically seeking truth as a journalist is terrible for your pocket. So it's a real concern that, yeah, absolutely.
I don't have an answer for you, and I'm not going to be able to recompense you today. But it's a little bit like the Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. There are elements of having the best of times, because you can develop a following. There is Twitter, and I think there's good Twitter and bad Twitter. And now, of course, now it's X, which I think is a reasonable rebranding of a kind of a damaged brand. Twitter files and all that kind of stuff prove. So there are ways of doing it, but there's always this undertow. you think you're body surfing, but somebody else is playing Jaws, shark music, and ready to get you. I think it was Franklin who said, it's a republic if you can keep it. And I forget who was talking about eternal vigilance is the I can't remember that quote, but you have to keep on your game. It's not like you get to be something. Maybe in an idealistic or simplistic view, you can, I don't know, make shoes and open a shoe store in 16th century England, and then that's what you do for your life, and everyone loves you, and you've made shoes, and but I think that's reductionist. I think the guy making shoes, they run against, may say, the Black Plague or something else. I mean, there were a lot of upheavals, and people's lives were being ushered around. We've always had this aspect of being the ants in a Toy Story movie, where somebody can just, the bad kid can focus a magnifying glass on you and zap you all to bits pretty quickly. I think this the people who look to power, they're a little bit skewed perhaps, and to get somebody who's good in power is, I don't think, the default position of mankind or humanity. So where would you lead people to develop a sense of reasonable scrutiny and caution and curiosity, as well as skepticism, such as seemingly you have developed?
I mean, I think the key thing is to not take anything for granted. Don't basically don't trust anything. You have to verify for yourself. You have to look at information presented to you, and look at it in a kind of cold scientific way before you to inform your opinion and your analysis and that kind of thing. And do not be. I mean, one of the things I've seen most over the last few years that's kind of been the most disappointing or maybe revealing is just how groupthink works. That people look for peers to know that it's okay to think a certain thing or a certain way. And that's so dangerous that, we have to maintain our intellectual independence, or else, we can be led in any which way. And I mean, that's what I've seen, in the COVID era, is that the left that I used to associate with is just gone. They're on another planet. They're not in reality.
So I think there are going to be, reformations and reformulations. Frankly, Donald Trump seems to make people's heads explode as just a word. Like, I have intimate, formerly close relatives, who still, revert to calling him his familial German name, Drumpf,
Right, right.
And there are people on Twitter who you have that as their monikers, their profile tag names, and so forth. And it's just like they can't even look at but he was emblematic of a redistribution. He won states that Hillary just took for granted.
Right.
In the upper Midwest, Michigan, which other ones? I think it was Minnesota. So anyway, he won places that Hillary just assumed were in the blue column, and there's a realignment. I treated. I had a medical practice locally I had my own practice for 27 years. I'm not doing that right now, but for a good length of time towards the end, I treated narcotic addicts with Suboxone. So I was tapering people, and there's a whole kind of neglected. It was Nixon's term, the silent majority, but it's not far off. There is this thing where people are, they are pretty much, being rocked by somebody else's, waves. And so they're in a boat. They just want to kind of do that thing, run the shoe store, like our, middle ages guy, and so forth. And they're buffeted. And I think Trump channeled into the distress and the enemy, the namelessness of a lot of young men throughout the middle of our country who are not, working at Google, not working at Twitter, not kind of buffeted, being held up by the winds of PR and so forth. And they wanted constructive things. And I think, Trump reindustrialized the country to a reasonable extent. And frankly, my, object of interest, the narcotic epidemic, the opioid epidemic, it went down for the first time in decades. And frankly, the only time, and it's back up again because of COVID and draconian measures and so forth. But when people are miserable, they're miserable, and they get more miserable because they spiral. And so, we're not going to find the perfect angel to be president, king, whatever, because they don't exist. So oftentimes, I think you're somewhat reliant on having a reasonable system. I think Madison, um, and the old white guys who founded the country, they understood that people are susceptible towards agglomeration of power and evil and so forth. And the best thing they could have was checks and balances. So at least you're set upon each other, and you can have the populace navigate between those forces of power. Um, so I guess the question that kind of comes to mind about Haiti and so forth, if we tend to like the revolutionary, who's keeping his neighborhood clean. I mean, I wonder, as a devil's advocate question, whether you got to see the Potemkin, sanitized village aspect of that. A, B, is there anything to lead us to believe that he's going to do better than what's around? And I don't know, does that just make us all miserable having to think about these things?
Well, I mean, no, I wasn't given like a Potemkin tour. It was. I mean, we toured all over, talked to various people.
Mhm.
I've been there to these areas multiple times. And he's really put his money where his mouth is. For example, last November, the U.S. government and IMF raised fuel prices in Haiti. So that basically made fuel completely unaffordable for about 99% of the population. And so, meaning, these people who are already very poor couldn't even, buy a gallon of gas to put in their motorcycle to take their kid to school, or to go to their job, to the sweatshop, or to sell their wares in the informal markets. They couldn't survive. So there were mass protests. He and his men actually went out and blockaded one of the fuel terminals, saying that either the government is going to put those, reduce the prices, put the fuel subsidies back in, or resign. And they held off for 45 days and, fighting against the corrupt Haitian National Police, until the U.S. and Canada sent in armored vehicles to overrun these guys. So,
Yeah.
so in the sense that, like, is he, really about what he says? I mean, he's put his life on the
What's
line.
his name?
His name is Jimmy Cherizier. His nickname is Barbecue. So a lot of people call him Barbecue because there was a lot of. I mean, the story is when he was a kid in the neighborhood, there were a lot of Jimmys, and so his mother sold grilled meats on the street. So he got
Yeah.
called Jimmy Barbecue.
Yeah.
So I mean, in I think someone who has real conviction like he does, if he can actually achieve what he wants to, I'm hopeful. But he's got a long way to go, and who knows? I
So
mean, the
as we
U.S.
round out the hour, I mean, I
Uh-huh.
can give you a little potluck choice of what you'd like to cover. I was interested in your bringing up something from, I forget what year it was, the Council of Foreign Relations, talking about the zombie apocalypse. We have a
Mhm.
clip. I actually have it speeded up a little bit so we could just post some aspects of it. I'll probably turn the sound off just so we can see some images of that, starting with you. I don't know if you want to just give us a preface for what that is, what it's about, and what did it mean to you?
Yeah, well, this video is from June 2019. What, 6, 7, 8 months before the COVID era, and it basically, I came across it. It's an unlisted video on a Council on Foreign Relations article, and the Council on Foreign Relations is the premier think tank in Washington, higher than any of the other think tanks.
Mhm.
And so they had this video that basically equates the flu to a zombie apocalypse, and says, and then goes on to, what would happen if a virus came along and it was equivalent to a zombie apocalypse. And it goes on to say we would do this and the next thing, and it was basically a script for the COVID era, what we went through. So this is June 2019, well, several months before the COVID era, and we're basically being told what's going to happen. So,
Yeah.
essentially suggesting.
I'm going to play it in the background without
Okay.
sound, a little bit faster. That I can get
Okay.
them on like almost 3x, 2x or something like that.
Okay.
But maybe we could just go look at some. I found the images impressive. So here it is. I mean, I think they want it to be arty. Maybe you could just give a little voiceover what we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, they're talking here about how your government is basically going to be superseded. Oh, this is the country that is trying to cover it up. to try to hide it, which I think, is what we're seeing. They're saying China is doing. Okay, there's my commentary, but I mean, that's one of the things that was so interesting to me is they're saying, well, this is going to be coming from some country that they actually show the map. Maybe we'll see it that, oh, it's China. And now there's the whole narrative of a lab leak from China. But if there is no pandemic, which we know from looking at excess, we see China is walled off.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so if there's no excess mortality until the countermeasures, lockdowns, et cetera, are imposed, then there was no pandemic. We had a bad flu season. So all of this stuff is basically planned out. And the idea of a lab leak, I think, is the counter narrative. It's the kind of limited hangout, controlled opposition narrative that has been deployed to kind of get the COVID dissident people on board with the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. How do you see it? The whole origin question.
So I was too busy engineering a little bit. Give me the question again.
Sure,
please.
sure. Well, so I mean, one of the things. This is actually how I came across this video. I'm doing an investigation on the kind of lab leak story, and really, the virus origin question, which the talk everyone thinks it came from a lab in the Wuhan lab, but the point I make is that if there was no pandemic, they created a virus that gives you the sniffles, that doesn't really
Right.
get you very sick. Like this is these evil scientists doing something that made nothing, that didn't kill anyone, that wasn't already going to die anyway. So
I'll give you my. Can I give you a 2-minute presentation?
Sure.
I like to go back to SARS 2003. There's classic Coke and new Coke.
Mm-hmm.
And so classic Coke was SARS 2003. And it's a bad enough virus. And there were issues in China with this virus because they were shuttling people around. There actually were some riots with the populace not liking having people brought in from other cities. And this is, I think, this triggered their Tiananmen Square piece of their brain, 1989 or whatever it was. And so here was 2003 and people were rioting. I think that is the real. So when we think about viruses and immune reactions, I think they're literal viruses, but a lot of what we're having as formations are against what the leaders actually fear. They don't fear the viruses so much as they fear in China rioting and being, I'm going to use as a verb, being Tiananmen squared. And they don't want to be, have their country, fall like the Soviet Union did.
Right.
But I think that's the real issue. And a lot of what China does is centered around that 2003, aspect of rioting. They did work on having a vaccine in China because there were issues with it. They ran against they ran into a wall because of ADE, antibody dependent enhancement,
right.
Which means because coronaviruses are so common, they're the second most common named cause of the common cold. So coronaviruses are nothing new. They've been around as long as humanity and probably every chimp and so forth. So coronaviruses are not new per se. When they come from an animal host, a zoonotic thing, they can come in indiscriminately, just like the flu comes from an animal host. Viruses that only circulate amongst humans they tend to self-attenuate and they become the common cold. So in the case of SARS, it probably did come from some zoonotic thing, pangolins or whatever, and so forth. But then it was kept in the lab and they were working on it because they cared about this. They did not want it to come back and they were trying to work on vaccines and so forth. So I think this was China's weak point, that they kept this thing alive. And I don't think it was a purposeful release, because then they would have released something. If it was a bioweapon, it would have been a better bioweapon. So I think it was accidental because it's not that severe. But getting back to the second part of the kind of this virus thing, I assume you're familiar with Pallywood, the term of art.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with the term.
Well, Pallywood is agitprop, done by the PLO and so forth, and they use actors to recreate or create scenes of havoc and mayhem. I think the hazmat suit, Wuhan scenes where people lying dead and so where nobody caring for that, I think that's a form of Pallywood, and CCP version of Pallywood. I think it was agitprop. So I think
if you real quick, I mean, for one thing, the term Pallywood, I don't like the. I mean, I've never seen any staged incidents carried out by like Palestinians. You know, I mean, I've seen a lot of Palestinians get killed. I mean, I've seen
Yeah, no,
Palestinians get killed.
I understood, and
But I do what you're saying,
I
and
appreciate your sympathies. We'll just call it agitprop.
that I can agree with
How
you.
about
That
that?
I'll agree with
And
you on
so we'll
100%.
call it agitprop, and so I think that's what it was. I think once the virus came out, I think it took China by surprise, and it was isolated in Wuhan. They reacted in a way to isolate that, kind of like a granuloma. They closed off Wuhan and so forth. And they have their own issues. They can do things we can't do there. And the lockdown terminology came into being because they wanted to overreact. They wanted to react, and they had to overreact to SARS-2 because of the riots from 2003, SARS-1. And again, getting back to Tiananmen Square, the thing they really fear is not the virus. They fear people's reactions. I don't think they play their hand well because people react when they get locked down. Anyway, so there you have it as far as that goes. But I think once it got released, I think China was at psychological Cold War with Donald Trump and vice versa. And I think they saw as an opportunity to screw with Donald Trump. And I think a lot of people in our public health establishment were complicit, not that they're CCP agents, but they also like to screw with Donald Trump. And so I think there was a conspiracy of interests where the Fauci and Birx and all these, various bureaucrats turned Donald Trump. And Jeffrey Tucker of Brownstone actually on Dr. Drew, he isolated when Trump's Twitter was restored or whatever, you could see the timeline on March 9th. He was like, this is just a flu, get on with our lives.
Right.
We've had flus before. And on March 11th, he's like, we have to lock down. Right. Somebody, and I think, somebody went to the calendar and he was with, I don't know, National Defense Council, whatever it's called, one of these groups. And I think they told him that this was a Chinese bioweapon. So I think they exaggerated because they wanted him to close down the economy and do a bunch of stuff that was against interest. And I think it was hugely successful. And the mail-in ballot was the biggest, item for harvestable votes ever. We already had absentee ballots. The mail-in ballot was unnecessary, but enough panic, enough fear became a political motivator. So I think that the real virus in China is fear of Tiananmen Square, and the real virus here was getting rid of Donald Trump, and everything was aggrandized for those purposes. And if there was going to be collateral damage, so be it. So that's my quasi conspiracy theory right there.
I think I agree with it. I agree with it in part. But one thing I would point out in terms of the agitprop, people in hazmat suits, and I mean the videos of people like falling over. If you remember those from China early on. There's an article, I think it's in Swiss Policy Research.
I've seen them. Yeah,
right.
I'm glad you know that one. I don't know the people who quote it, but I always found their stuff really interesting.
I mean, it's I found it to be, at least the articles I looked at, to be well researched. And there's one that's on those videos of people. We got coronavirus and just people collapsing in the street, which is obviously absurd. And those videos are done by outlets funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. Are you familiar with the NED?
No, but you mentioned earlier as a CIA front. I'm not
exactly.
I've not spent as much time in all this stuff as you have.
It's a totally notorious CIA front. It's one of really the most important ones.
Although we're rounding towards the hour. I do want to leverage your knowledge. Maybe we'll have to do this offline for our audience. But I'm just going to segue into briefly my thing, which is the Zika microcephaly pandemic. And I don't know what your knowledge about that is. Brazil 2015?
Nothing.
So you've heard of it, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware. I've been told Zika is dangerous for pregnant women.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. No, there was the only problem was that they didn't do any science. And as Gertrude Stein said about Oakland, there is almost literally no there. There was no scientific study showing there was Zika in the first place in Brazil, and there was no real comparison. There was no birth registry for microcephaly in Recife. In the years prior, they had the wrong standard. Somebody who wanted to connect one thing to the other did so probably for his personal aggrandizement, and didn't announce things prematurely without a study. There was a panic, and then everything kind of overboiled. That's why you never see any microcephaly increases anywhere else on Earth, even in Brazil, Northeast Brazil, ever since. It was only that 1 year. Everyone's got explanations. Oh, it must have been a special strain. Everyone got sudden immunity, all this kind of stuff. But Zika is basically a mini version of dengue, and dengue has been around for generations. if not hundreds of years in Brazil. And it's called breakbone fever, and it's apparent, kind of a nasty flu and all that kind of stuff. And the interesting, for me, the interesting part about this, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but is that there were scientists in advance hoping to find a new virus in Northeast Brazil. They started in 2014. They called themselves Chick V, the mission, and it was named for chikungunya virus because that's the one that hadn't been in Brazil yet, just like Zika. And they were hoping it was going to be there. Why would they want a virus to be there? They wanted a virus because they wanted to form an agitprop. They wanted attention and money to go to the Northeast, the poorer part of Brazil. It's kind of upside down from the U.S., so it's hotter, darker skin on average, and hotter and so forth. And so they wanted a virus to be there, and they named it after the 1986 Jeremy Irons, Robert De Niro movie, The Mission, where the Indians were treated, the Paraguayan Indians were treated poorly, and the Jesuits kind of helped them, and the European colonialists were bad, so forth. So they saw themselves as virtuous in bringing a virus to the area, and they would bring money and attention. It's an incredible story, and nobody's talking about it except me. Maybe because I'm crazy, but maybe not. But it's one of these where your bread is buttered. All the people who are on the part of the Zika, I've sent letters to 889 Zika researchers, and I get back like almost zero responses. And I just want them to look at this because it's disappeared, and nobody has a good theory, except they kind of all have a locust kind of theory that, it's going to be gone 12 years from now, it's going to come back or whatever. But nobody has a good theory about why Zika doesn't cause microcephaly anywhere else on Earth ever since. Anyway, that's kind of my thing. I was maybe give it a picture here so I can tell people about it. I mean, this is how I hope to, if people want to come to my site here, it's on Amazon. It's actually being published in Brazil right now. Here's a picture of me, Zika, the pandemic that never was. I like people to kind of look at it. Jay Bhattacharya has read my articles on the topic, and I think he endorses my idea. Anyway, so last words from Dan Cohen.
Yeah, I mean, just stay free, stay uncaptured. No, thanks a lot for having me.
It's been fascinating. I wish you the best of luck, and I have been following you on Twitter, and there are some kind of eye-opening things that you put out there. So I appreciate the intrepid part and the bravery. And there are very few people who are willing to put their feet on the ground in a lot of the places you've gone. So there's that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So how can people support you?
You can subscribe to my Substack, uncaptured.media. That'll take you to my Substack. You can buy me a coffee, .com/uncaptured. You can support my Patreon. I think all those links are in my link tree there. So that's my profile picture there. That goofy picture is with me with the former president of Colombia. I confronted on the streets of Washington, D.C. about a month ago. I ran into him. His campaign was funded by drug traffickers, so I confronted him on the street about that.
Yeah, I mean, the guy what's his name, Petro, who took over.
Yeah.
He's a Maduro / Chavista potentially. He's a former guerrilla, and I you go from the frying pan to the fire kind of thing. He wants to legalize cocaine. He's not going after the cocaine growers. He says he's going to go after the big narcos, but I think he wants to monetize cocaine. Now, I think there are a lot of issues. It's a deep layered thing because, you have supply, but you also need demand. So people are snorting cocaine or, basically not just through the straw, but they're pulling it up from, South America and whatnot. So I think there's some complicity across the board. But it's, I just don't know. I tend to lean right. And I think that what we've seen from Lula in Brazil, kind of making a ministry of truth and closing down, making some things, unallowable, potentially by law to say, is an issue. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see whether the anti-Duque forces are any better.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically what's happened over the decades is Colombia has been transformed into a total narco state where drug traffickers basically run everything. And Petro he's not from that. I mean, like you said, he's a former guerrilla fighter. I mean, he's been out of that for decades, but he's like a progressive politician. I mean, so what I see I was in Colombia in May is the last time I was there. I've been there multiple times. I was deep in the coca growing area, for example. I mean, all around me, like coca, coca, coca. And so what's happening is, for one thing, there's a huge drop in demand for cocaine internationally, largely because fentanyl has replaced a lot of it. Um, and so, but you have an entire economy based on cocaine, the export of coca, and almost all of that money does not go to Colombia itself. It goes to Mexican drug cartels in the United States and gets laundered, through banks and this kind of thing. And so I don't think that Petro is interested in cocaine or trying to make money off it or anything like that. He is going after the big drug. He's going after some of the big paramilitaries and narcos in Colombia. The problem is that if you mess with just one link in that system, one part of it, you know, it's helps create a crisis for the people who depend on that, for these poor farmers in the rural regions who have no choice but to grow coca, which becomes cocaine. So they want to grow, mangoes and avocados and coffee and this and that, but the state has to come and basically develop the roads, and transform the economy from just growing coca to growing normal produce, normal products, and getting them to national and international markets. That's the big challenge, and I don't think that Petro can even accomplish it, in part because a lot of the money. There was a historic peace accord in 2016 between the FARC and the government,
right?
The state, rather.
Is he post FARC?
I'm sorry?
Is Petro post FARC?
He wasn't part of FARC. He was part of another guerrilla movement that hasn't existed since, I think, like the early 90s. So he's been in politics for a long time. He was the mayor of Bogota, for example. But yeah, so he's not connected to those guerrilla movements at all. But basically what happened is there's this huge peace accord. The guerrillas, the FARC, says, okay, we're going to lay down our arms. The government is supposed to come in and develop the whole economy, get rid of the paramilitaries and all this stuff. And then the government didn't do what it was supposed to do. So all these guerrillas laid down their weapons and said, we're going to reintegrate into society, and they got screwed. So the government is just, basically done nothing. And Duque, he and his cronies stole a bunch of the money that was assigned to implementing this peace accord. So that's kind of what Petro was handed. And he's talked about it publicly. He's like, I want to implement this peace accord, but there's literally no money for it. It's all been stolen. So in that way, I sympathize with Petro. The part I don't sympathize with is he's very much into the whole green economy, green development, which I see as basically a farce. And again, that's a thing that, like, a lot of leftists believe in, like COVID, but is really just another. I mean,
right.
Another big scam.
Yeah. Have you listened to Konstantin Kisin?
No.
So he's big. He's a big internet phenomenon.
I've seen that. Yes, I've seen that name. Yes. But I haven't really listened to him.
Kisin. And he was on some, I think it was Oxford Debate Society. Mm-hmm. And the little clip from that is just like, has, I'm not sure whether it's actually literally a zillion, but a lot of views. Mm-hmm. And he talks about, a lot of this green stuff. And it says, you think everyone on this side of the debate aisle, the right side, the conservative side, we don't, we want the earth to burn. We don't want green this and that. We don't want clean. We do. But we just acknowledge that if you have a child in a developing country, Kenya or someplace, that parents want that child to eat. Right. That's the primary thing. And if having the kid eat means that they have to run the jalopy into town and buy fertilizer, whatever, they're going to do that. That's primary. Until you have kids, until you understand that there's something more compelling than the earth, that is your family and so forth. you're not going to make any progress. And he said he was in England, so he said even if the British Isles fell into the ocean or the sea at this moment, it wouldn't change whatever let's stipulate the carbon dioxide, whatever it is, whatever villain, ecologic villain you want to have, it wouldn't make any much difference because most of this is coming from, Latin America, and most of the increase is going to come from the developing world. And
Right.
part of it's already come from China. So for all the greater use and so forth. So if that is your agenda, you're always looking in the wrong place. You're not going to get India and China to divert from having their populations fed, clothed, and have commerce that you were able to get.
Absolutely.
And there's also kind of a weird perversion that you're seeing in the Netherlands and all these other places that are, quote unquote green. They want to get rid of nitrogen. They've moved chemicals. Right. I was a chemistry major, and whenever they talk about these things, they talk about nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and so on. Carbon dioxide is like 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. It's negligible, and it's been higher and lower at different times in the history of humanity. And nitrogen is, of course, not nitrogen. I mean, nitrogen in the air is N2, and then there's nitron. There's I don't know against this whole thing.
Yeah, it's a lot of
but they come up with these guideposts and that have really very little factual basis, and they're going to upend.
Exactly.
Netherlands is like literally the most efficient farming community on Earth.
Right.
And possibly all planets, because we haven't been to many other planets. But and they just want to stop it. I mean, the people in Africa, between the Ukraine war, and Ukraine was like the breadbasket, and basically the Nebraska of East Europe.
Right.
They get rid of Nebraska, and now they're going to get rid of this huge farming, I guess juggernaut in the Netherlands. Like, where is food going to happen? Where people in Africa, it'd be wonderful if they could do all that on their own, but they haven't been able to so far, and they've got a lot of shaky regimes. And obviously, there's a lot, the big, if they wanted to care about something green, they should look to money. They should make transparency in where the money goes. You were mentioning the Haiti money that got absconded, kind of laundered through NGOs and whatnot. The money is the problem. That when we give money, financial aid, whatever, to Ghana, it doesn't wind up with Joe Farmer. It winds up with Joe bureaucrat and his cronies and so forth. So the real green problem is I don't think environmental. I think it's the color of money.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I see the green thing as a big scam. It's extremely profitable, and they just need some kind of mythology to sell it that the climate is collapsing and we're all gonna die and that kind of thing, and scare people. And
so if you and I manage to live another couple of weeks, maybe we could get together again and chat about some of the follow up to this.
Sure, sounds good.
I'm honored. I'm very much in your debt. If there's anything I can do for you, favors, let me know. But thank you so much, and thank you for audience for listening so far, and I'll try to post this soon.
Thanks a lot.